To 10 now. Support for President Cyril Ramaphosa's management of the COVID-19 threat has diminished as the lockdown has eased. Well, this is the finding of research by the Human Sciences Research Council and the University of Johannesburg Centre for Social Change. Their survey reveals that the decline in confidence is across the socio-economic divide. Well, let's find out more about what happened. We chat now to the head of the HSRC Developmental, Capable and Ethical State Division, Professor Narnia Bohler-Muller. Prof, a very good morning. Thanks for your time this morning. So, in the beginning, yes, we saw, we kind of rallied behind President Cyril Ramaphosa. Of course, we had those who were unhappy with the ban on alcohol and tobacco for a while, but mostly people felt that the president and his team were doing what was needed. So what has happened to that support, and can we pinpoint from when it started to decline?
Well, the support was very high right at the beginning with regards to level 5. So everybody felt very positive about what the president did. He was decisive. He did the right thing. He was praised internationally for making the decisions that he had made. And I think it's people.
All right, we seem to have a problem there with the prof sound. Prof, just checking if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, great. All right, do continue. Sorry, you were saying, yes, from when do we notice this decline in support?
Fine. So with regards to the decline, it started happening around about the beginning of level 4. And I think that may have been because people were feeling quite confused about the regulations that were being brought in place. The virus, the pandemic was starting to show growth. More people were dying. And there was an increase in fear. So we see at level 3 that popularity had dropped by 24%. And this is really now at 61% approval rating, relatively high. It's still higher than the president's approval rating was prior to COVID. So it has dropped, but I think it's just dropped to normal levels. Also, people were starting to feel frustrated and angry because of the lockdown and, of course, the economy's problems.
So how much of it had to do, yes, I mean, just to expand on what you've just said, had to do with what people were experiencing for themselves, the level of frustration we got to, or what the president and his team were doing or not doing at that point?
Well, I think partially both. So they were not really fast-tracking the food parcels. There were major issues with very hungry people receiving food. Also, the payment of the 350 Rand grant, there were issues there as well as with UIF. So those were very practical things that were increasing frustration. Also, the regulations that were being introduced were not understandable to the public. And it was very clear from public commentary that especially the alcohol and cigarette ban, and of course initially the clothing ban, just didn't make sense. And so because it didn't make sense, people started feeling less confident in the leadership. More confident in the president than in the national government. I think there's about a 10% difference in confidence.
So did your research cover the time of the corruption scandal, the PPE tender scandals and all of that? Did it cover that? And I'd love to know, what sort of confidence or support levels we're actually doing at that point or since then.
At the beginning, we're on phase 1 of the second round of the survey, but towards the end, when we were pulling the data, it was very clear that the news around corruption, gender-based violence, and increased crime was affecting the impressions of people. We had an open-ended question, for example, where people were writing a lot about their concerns about corruption and that nothing can be done, and especially people taking advantage of the pandemic in order to make money. It was quite an effect, especially in terms of the open-ended questions and the comments that were made by respondents.
All right. So do they blame government? Do they single out whether it was the president who should have known better, or do they sort of place this at the door of people who are trying to take advantage of this?
The rhetoric in the public is always kind of political. So there will always be chances taken in terms of gaining political points. So the usual suspects are government, and government is not doing anything about corruption. But there's also some proof that some members of government were involved, or at least family members of members in government were involved in the corruption scandals. And I think that makes it far worse. So ultimately, government will always be the scapegoat in a situation like this, even though it's the private sector that's also involved in this corruption.
Well, in terms of support, Prof, I mean, I suppose we also have to reflect on how far South Africans are willing to go to actually make this work, to get the numbers down when it comes to our COVID-19 infections. Was there any reflection of that as to, in terms of how much they were willing to stand behind these efforts, the rules and regulations being put in place by the President and his team, and how far they were willing to go or sacrifice?
Well, people really are willing to sacrifice quite a lot. The human rights that we asked people whether they were prepared to sacrifice human rights in order to stop the spread of COVID. And more than 60% of South Africans are actually prepared to do it very strongly, feeling very strongly about that. And in this round, we actually gave them some examples of rights that they would be willing to sacrifice. And 56% of the people who were willing to sacrifice rights were willing not to go to their places of worship. And that was interesting, because one of the first places that were opened by the president were the churches, the mosques and the temples and the synagogues. But South Africans weren't necessarily keen to go to these places of worship, and also people were very much prepared to sacrifice their right of movement, to travel around, either inside the country or outside. The right that people were least happy to sacrifice was privacy, which is quite important, because about double that amount of people were prepared to sacrifice their right to go to work. What is interesting, we did a little bit of probing around the political parties, and what really stood out was ANC members were mostly prepared to sacrifice their right to go to work, and EFF members were mostly prepared to sacrifice their rights to go to school or university.
That is indeed very interesting, Prof. Well, let's hope we can expand on this as you analyze the next phase of this. I'd be very interested to know, since the easing of these restrictions, we're now in level 2, just, whether that has changed. Thanks so much, Professor Narnia Bohler-Muller from the HSRC.